It was, Lord Peter Wimsey reflected, not the first time he had been invited to tea in order to investigate a corpse. Though rarely, he thought, had it been by a clergyman's wife who insisted on serving rhubarb tart in June, and insisted even more fervently that it wasn't murder, of course, but something was quite wrong. The village of Follymead in Gloucestershire, like most English villages observed under a veil of rain and lilac blossom, had the outward appearance of mild lunacy and inward composition of barbed wire and secrets. Lord Peter, who had cultivated an affection for such places, provided they offered passable tobacco and indifferent respect for law, had come at the behest of his sister, Lady Mary. She had, in a letter of precisely 6 sentences and a tea stain, declared, "You must come. There's been a death. It's all quite tiresome, but the greenhouse is locked, and no one will explain why the cactus keeps being watered." This, naturally, had intrigued Wimsey immensely. He arrived in trademark fashion, not with luggage but with quotations, and was promptly deposited at the vicarage where Mrs. Tavers, a woman who maintained the perpetually startled air of someone recently introduced to electricity, insisted upon offering him both spiritual guidance and rhubarb-based refreshment. "I do hope you won't be disturbed," she said, lowering her voice as if invoking Macbeth, "by the unpleasantness." "Disturbance, dear madam, is the soul's aspirin," said Wimsey, peering through his pince-nez at the bubbling tart. "But what sort of unpleasantness are we speaking of? Broken hymns? Collapsing clerics? Or the far graver sin of botanical impropriety?" Mrs. Tavers glanced nervously at the garden. "It's Dr. Delmore, you see. From the hall, he passed quite unexpectedly last Thursday, in the greenhouse, and of course, everyone says it was the heart. Always the heart, isn't it, when one dies standing up without explanation?" "Not everyone," said Wimsey. "Some say it's poison, or guilt, or even the infernal devices." He smiled to show he was being clever. Mrs. Tavers did not smile back. "It's the way they've shut it up, Lord Peter. The greenhouse. You can see the steam on the glass even now, but no one's been let inside since, and the cactus, well, it's been watered, hasn't it? Only no one admits to going in." Wimsey leaned slightly towards the window, indeed the far end of the vicarage garden, visible over a hedge of drooping yew and some unnecessarily vigorous delphiniums, revealed a rather ornate greenhouse of the Victorian persuasion, its panes half fogged, its iron frame suggestively rusted. A crow, either melancholy or malicious, hopped once along the peak of the roof. "Extraordinary," Wimsey murmured. "The dead man lies among the bromeliads, and yet the ficus lives on. One is tempted to suspect metaphysics." Mrs. Tavers, who had clearly hoped for a more spiritually hygienic response, retreated to her teacups. "And Dr. Delmore," said Wimsey after a pause. "What sort of fellow was he?" "Oh, very precise. Not at all warm. Lived at Delmore Hall with his niece, young Miss Marjorie, who is artistic. There was an awful row some weeks ago, something about the cook. Or perhaps it was the will. I dare say someone knows." Wimsey smiled. "They always do." "And the police," added Mrs. Tavers, "have no interest. Just another gentleman with a faulty heart. But no one's seen the will since. Nor the cook, come to think of it." "Then," said Wimsey, rising and brushing a crumb of tart from his cuff, "I think it high time we visited the cactus, to water it, if nothing else." He stepped out into the garden, coat flapping slightly, and lit a Turkish cigarette with a slow and theatrical flare. He paused, then turned back toward the vicarage window. "One thing, Mrs. Tavers. When precisely did Dr. Delmore die?" "Last Thursday, around 4 o'clock, they say." "Curious," said Wimsey to no one in particular. "Because the parish clock struck 4 precisely as I arrived, and unless I'm very much mistaken, it's running 5 minutes fast." With that, and a whistle of what sounded like a fragment of the Mikado, he strolled toward the shuttered greenhouse, where death had come calling amongst the orchids. Lord Peter Wimsey's shoes made little sound on the gravel path, but the yew hedge seemed to hush itself as he passed, as though recognizing that something unusually observant was abroad. He moved at an idle stroll, the way one might approach a tennis court or a sleeping dog. Not the place where a man had lately died in an airtight glass box full of tropical plants. The greenhouse stood at the far end of the vicarage garden, behind a squat brick wall and a disused sundial that now told only the hour of its own irrelevance. Up close, the structure proved larger than it appeared from the vicarage windows, a miniature cathedral of wrought iron and misted panes, with a small levered door of narrow glass and peeling paint. The lock had been replaced, new brass, still yellow and smug in the light, and a discreet, private, inquiry pending sign was wired above the latch. Wimsey circled it once, noting the vent flaps, the single drain pipe, clogged with last year's leaves, and a curious smudge near the rear sill, perhaps where a boot had scuffed during some hasty exit, or, more intriguingly, entry. He crouched, pinched a leaf off a nearby fern, and sniffed it absently. "Dead at 4 o'clock, he murmured to himself. Clock 5 minutes fast, window latches rusted, and still the cactus drinks. He straightened, dusted off his knees, and turned, somewhat theatrically, to find a small figure watching him from behind a hydrangea. She was dressed in black, without frivolity, and had the uncertain posture of someone accustomed to standing in corners at family gatherings. "Miss Marjorie Delmore, I presume?" said Wimsey with a slight bow. She tilted her head very slightly. "You've a good guess, or a good memory. My aunt mentioned you might appear." "Ah, and what did she say?" "That you are some kind of gentleman," she replied with admirable neutrality, "who enjoyed quoting obscure Latin and making policemen nervous." "A fair summary," he said, smiling. "May I ask, if it's not indelicate, whether you were here when your uncle died?" "I was in the drawing-room," she said, "sketching. I heard nothing, no cry or collapse. They say his heart simply stopped." "Convenient hearts when they behave so obligingly," murmured Wimsey. And yet you don't believe it," she said. "Is that why you've come?" "I believe," said Wimsey lightly, "that greenhouses, like family estates, always have more inside than they should, and that overwatered cacti are nature's way of sounding an alarm." Marjorie gave him a thin smile. Not affectionate, but not entirely hostile. "My uncle," she said, "was particular about the greenhouse. No one else was permitted to tend it. Even the gardener kept his distance. When he died, the door was locked from the inside. The key was found in his waistcoat pocket." "Locked from the inside," repeated Wimsey, frowning slightly. "Was the body found at once?" "It was found by Mrs. Clyburn, my aunt, an hour later. She went to fetch him for tea. He hadn't answered the bell." "And in that hour," asked Wimsey, "did anyone else see the greenhouse? Walk near it? Hear anything?" She shook her head. "Not that I know of. And I didn't think anything of it until I noticed the soil in the orchid pots was damp 2 days later. That's when I knew someone had been inside." "Or had never left," said Wimsey quietly. They stood for a moment, both gazing at the greenhouse, where the sun now glinted through the condensation, revealing ghostly silhouettes of leaves and stems pressed against the inside of the glass. After a pause, Marjorie said, "You should speak to Hollis. He was the manservant. My uncle trusted him more than anyone. More than me, certainly. But he's grown nervous since the death. He says he saw something strange, but won't say what." "I do like a nervous manservant," said Wimsey. "They're so often right in the end." He accompanied her back toward the house, where the Gothic majesty of Delmore Hall rose in red brick and ivy just beyond the vicarage garden. A long, low structure with a central gable and too many chimneys, like a Dickensian orphanage that had taken up amateur astronomy. Inside, he was led through halls hung with ancestral scowls and into a side parlour where Hollis, gaunt, grey and straight as an old sword, stood polishing a silver salver that did not need polishing. His hands trembled faintly. "Mr. Hollis," said Whimsy without introduction, "I am come about the cactus." Hollis blinked. "Sir, the one in the greenhouse. Someone's been watering it. Since Dr. Delmore's death, and unless I am mistaken, you've not set foot in that greenhouse yourself since?" "No, sir, I have not, nor would I." "Why?" Hollis paused. "Because he told me never to, sir. It were his rule. Said the plants had a schedule, a discipline, that no one must interfere." "And yet," said Whimsy, "someone has. Do you know who?" Hollis's mouth twisted. "No, sir. But I've seen the light on, sir. Twice, late at night. No footsteps in the gravel the next morning, and the padlock still in place." Whimsy's brow rose. "You're sure?" "Yes, sir. Quite sure. And there's something else." "The bell." "The what?" "The service bell in the hall. It's on a manual line, see? Pull cord from the greenhouse wall to the servants' passage. But that cord was disconnected years ago. Still, I heard it ring. Just once. The night after he died." Whimsy stared at the man, silently for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and examined the wall beside the fireplace, where a polished brass panel bore 6 tarnished labels and a row of tiny hammers. He reached out and touched the greenhouse label. The metal was cold. "When did it ring precisely?" "Just before midnight, sir. I was in the pantry. No one else heard it. I thought I'd imagined it." "Imagination is a wonderful thing, Hollis," murmured Whimsy. "But I find it rarely waters cacti." He turned away, then paused. "One last question. Did Dr. Delmore receive any curious visitors in the weeks before he died?" Hollis hesitated. "A woman, sir, a few weeks ago. Mid-30s, dark hair, very abrupt. Came from London, I believe. Wore gloves, even in the drawing room. She stayed just an hour. No name given." "Did she return?" "No, sir. But the doctor was quiet after she left. Quieter than usual. That's when he had the locks changed." Whimsy smiled faintly. "Locks and cacti and ringing bells. We do have the makings of a small opera, don't we?" He thanked Hollis, made a mental note to interview the housekeeper, who, he suspected, would be both irritable and informative, and took his leave of the room. Marjorie was waiting in the hall, arms crossed. "Well," she said. "Your uncle," said Whimsy, "may have had a cardiac event, yes, but it appears he also had a visitor, a secret bell system, and a nocturnal ghost with a watering can, all of which are rather bad for the heart." "You believe he was murdered?" "I believe," said Whimsy, slipping on his gloves, "that someone wanted us to believe he died at 4, that the padlock is a flourish, and that the cactus, poor beast, is growing in unnatural comfort." He turned and looked once more toward the distant greenhouse, where the sun was now retreating behind, a bank of lavender-gray clouds. A single drop of water slid down the outside of the glass, like a tear falling backward. "I think," he said softly, "we should find the cook." Lord Peter Whimsy's inquiries began, as they so often did, with a most uncooperative cook. Mrs. Blount had been with the Delmore household for 17 years, and it took only moments in her presence to understand why she remained employed, despite what could only be described as a sustained campaign against delicacy and conversation. A large-boned woman with a complexion like overworked pastry and a gaze that might curdle milk, she met Whimsy's polite greeting with a grunt and returned to peeling potatoes with an air of martyrdom that suggested she had once survived the siege of Leningrad and found it less inconvenient than questions. "I understand," Whimsy said gently, "that you took a few days' leave just before Dr. Delmore's unfortunate demise." She scraped a long curl from a potato and dropped it with theatrical finality into a basin. "I was due it, of course," he agreed. "I merely wondered where you went." "Western Supermare." Whimsy allowed this to hang in the air a moment, as though contemplating whether such a destination implied innocence or guilt. Bracing, he said finally. Mrs. Blount did not respond. Your return, I take it, was delayed. She looked up now, her small eyes wary. I came back Sunday night, got the train. 2 days after the doctor's death. Whimsy made a small note in his book, though he already knew the answer. And no one saw you until Monday morning. I went straight to my rooms. I'm not in the habit of knocking on doors past midnight. Nor, said Whimsy, is death. She narrowed her eyes. Are you suggesting I had something to do with it, my lord? Not at all, he replied with infuriating lightness. Merely curious, Mrs. Blount. After all, Dr. Delmore was a man of routines. Meals served to the minute, was he not? Ran this house like a railway timetable, she muttered. And if someone, continued Whimsy, wanted to tamper with his meals, say, to administer something that might be mistaken for a heart attack, it would help if the cook were conveniently absent, wouldn't it? Mrs. Blount stood very still. I do my job. I don't ask questions, and I don't like mine being asked either. Whimsy smiled, perfectly agreeable. Entirely understandable. One last thing. Was Dr. Delmore in the habit of locking the greenhouse from the inside when working? He always took the key with him. Wouldn't let the gardener near the place. Said amateurs over water. Used to mutter about rhythms and silence. Truth be told, I think he was half cracked. Cracked men make the finest orchids, murmured Whimsy. But tell me, what did he eat for lunch on Thursday? There was a long pause. Then, surprisingly, she answered. Cold, beef, mustard, pickled onions. The same as always on Thursdays. No soup? No, he hated soup. Curious, said Whimsy softly. Because Mrs. Tavers distinctly remembered a soup bowl in the washing pile. Thursday evening, a green ring around the bottom, she said, like pea or watercress. Mrs. Blount's eyes flicked once, then back to the potato. She's mistaken. Possibly. But so rarely, I find, are rhubarb tarts and soup bowls mistaken in the same week. Whimsy turned to go, but paused in the doorway. If you do remember anything else, he said, especially about a visitor in gloves or an uncharacteristic request from the master, I'd be delighted to hear it. She did not answer, but her silence had grown markedly more deliberate. Back in the hall, Whimsy found Marjorie seated near the parlor window with a stack of sketchbooks in her lap, though she appeared not to be drawing so much as brooding theatrically in pen and charcoal. She looked up. She won't talk, she said simply. Oh, she did, said Whimsy, seating himself, just enough to suggest she might talk again, given the proper inducement or threat of culinary disgrace. She loathed him, you know, Marjorie said. Uncle. She never said it, of course, but you could taste it in the gravy. And you? Did you loathe him too? She hesitated, then met his gaze. I was afraid of him. Not in the way you'd fear a brute, in the way one fears a surgeon, cold, precise, and always watching. He had this belief that people could be arranged, controlled, like his orchids. He used to say that given enough time, he could make anything bloom. An admirable ambition, said Whimsy. She shook her head. No, it was the control he liked, not the beauty. A silence settled between them, made heavier by the distant chime of the quarter hour. Whimsy tapped his pencil on the notebook in his hand. You mentioned a quarrel, he said, between your uncle and Mrs. Blount. She wanted to leave. He wouldn't give her a reference. She said something about knowing too much, and he told her that loyalty was a condition of employment, not a virtue. Knowing too much, said Whimsy slowly. And yet he let her leave, days before he died. Unless he thought she'd never say anything, or that she was frightened enough to keep silent. Whimsy closed the notebook and stood. I think it's time I had another look at that greenhouse. The greenhouse remained locked, but a brief conversation with the estate's solicitor, who had arrived that morning under the impression he was executing a will that no one could produce, secured a temporary writ to inspect the premises. The key was fetched from Delmore's dressing table, still nestled in the pocket of the waistcoat he had died wearing. A grim little ritual, but one Whimsy performed with reverent detachment. With Hollis as witness and a hesitant Marjorie watching from the path, Whimsy unlocked the greenhouse. The door creaked open, releasing a rush of air thick with moist earth, stale decay, and a faint but unmistakable trace of something metallic. Whimsy stepped inside, the warmth wrapping around him like a wet cloth. Rows of orchids, bromeliads, and succulents lined the shelves, each in varying states of pampered growth. A watering can stood beneath the bench, damp at the spout. Whimsy moved slowly, examining the soil, the alignment of pots, the condensation patterns on the glass. In the far right corner, a table held gardening tools, a packet of quinine powder, and a bottle of something labeled iron tonic. He opened it, sniffed once, and replaced it. "What are you looking for?" Marjorie asked from the doorway. "The thing that doesn't belong," he said absently. Behind one of the benches, near the lowest shelf, he found it, a teacup. Not of greenhouse stock. This one bore the family crest, and a rim stained green. He held it up. "The soup bowl's cousin," he said. Marjorie frowned. "He never took tea in here. That's what the drawing room was for." "Precisely," said Whimsy. He moved to the far wall where the bell cord still hung, a little frayed at the end, but intact. He gave it the gentlest tug, and somewhere deep in the house, a single chime sounded. Whimsy looked at Hollis, who flinched. "Midnight," he said. "And someone was here to pull it." On the bench beside the cactus, he found the last clue, a pair of gardening gloves, crusted with soil, lying neatly folded. Inside one finger, tucked away as though hidden in haste, was the corner of a torn envelope. Written in ink, spidery and blurred with moisture, were the final letters of a name. Well. He turned it in his hand and smiled. "There's a pattern," he murmured. "There's always a pattern." Marjorie tilted her head. "And do you see it yet?" "Not all," he admitted. "But someone meant to kill him slowly, and someone else hastened the matter, perhaps even without realizing it." He turned back to the door. "And now," he said, "we must find the woman in gloves." He closed the greenhouse behind him, the key heavy in his hand. Somewhere in the orchids, a single drop of water slid from a leaf and fell onto the stone floor with the faintest sound. A sound like a secret landing. Lord Peter Whimsy stood a moment longer on the greenhouse threshold, the torn scrap of envelope still pinched delicately between thumb and forefinger. Marjorie had stepped aside without a word, but her eyes followed his movements with feline precision. Behind them, Hollis hovered with the faintly twitching demeanor of a man who feared both being dismissed and being asked to stay. Whimsy pocketed the fragment with care. "Hollis, have any letters gone missing recently? Particularly ones addressed to Dr. Delmore?" The manservant frowned. "Not that I'm aware of, sir. He kept his correspondence locked in his study cabinet. Very particular about it. Wouldn't even let me dust the top drawer." "Good. That's precisely what I'll be looking at next." Whimsy paused. "And I don't suppose you ever saw your master receive post from anyone named Maxwell? Or Blackwell? Any surname ending in well?" Hollis gave it a moment's honest thought. "No, sir. Nothing I recall." "Very well. Miss Delmore, would you be so kind as to show me to your uncle's study?" Marjorie led him through a pair of double doors and down a narrow corridor where the wallpaper seemed to absorb sound. The study was a long room with tall windows, half covered in gauze curtains, shelves crowded with medical texts and monographs, and a desk so orderly it might have belonged to a bank clerk with a deep fear of dust. Whimsy moved toward it with reverence, as if approaching the tomb of a particularly meticulous pharaoh. He began at the surface. Blotter, fountain pen, letter opener, a silver-framed photograph of a woman who bore just enough resemblance to Marjorie to suggest blood but none of the warmth of kinship. A drawer yielded stationery, all embossed with the Delmore crest. Another revealed a file of case studies, some neatly annotated, others with only a single phrase underlined. Intentional suppression of cardiac symptoms. Whimsy lingered on that one. "Tell me," he said, not looking up, "did your uncle practice privately here?" Marjorie had seated herself in a low armchair by the window. "Not officially, but there were consultations. Mostly friends or former patients who didn't want the fuss of hospitals. They'd come in through the side entrance. Was he paid?" "Not always. Sometimes they brought gifts. Wine, imported teas. He liked rare things." Whimsy nodded slowly. He turned to the locked cabinet. "Do you by chance have the key?" She did not, but Hollis fetched again, and producing a ring of keys like a Victorian jailer, eventually found one that fit. The lock gave way with a small, stubborn click. Inside were folders labeled with dates and initials, and in a shallow tray at the back, a bundle of letters tied with black ribbon. Whimsy withdrew the bundle and untied it. The handwriting was fine, slanted, unmistakably feminine. One envelope bore the return address, C. Blackwell, 73A Rutherford Place, London. He held it up wordlessly. Marjorie stood. "That's her, the woman I told you about. The one in gloves." Whimsy examined the envelope, postmarked 3 weeks prior. He slid the letter free. The writing was precise, but the language trembled at the edges. "Dr. Delmore, you cannot imagine the courage it takes to write this. I've not forgotten your promise. You said you would protect me if ever it came to light, but now I hear whispers, and I fear you may no longer be in a position to help. If it happens again, I will be forced to act. Please, keep your part of the bargain, or I must keep mine." No signature, but the paper smelled faintly of perfume, citrus and sandalwood. Whimsy read the letter twice, then folded it carefully. "Now we begin to see it," he murmured. A woman who feared exposure, a promise unkept, a leverage lost. Marjorie said nothing, but her expression had tightened. "You think she killed him?" she asked at last. "I think," said Whimsy, "that she threatened to, but threats are rarely carried out by the person who makes them. More often they provoke someone else, someone who sees their opportunity." He tucked the letter into his notebook and rose. "Do you know anyone named Maxwell? Or Hartswell? Could be part of the same circle." Marjorie hesitated. "There was a Hartswell at the university, a junior lecturer in chemistry. He came here once, years ago. Uncle dismissed him after an argument. I don't remember much, except he left without his coat." "Interesting," said Whimsy. "Did your uncle keep up any correspondence with the university?" "Only through a Dr. Finch. They published together once. But that was years ago." Whimsy considered this. "It's time I made a few telephone calls. May I use the study line?" She nodded and left him alone. Whimsy dialed the London number of the Yard first, requesting that Parker look into C. Blackwell, Rutherford Place, any known associates, medical histories, or public records. Then he rang Oxford, and after some delay was connected to the chemistry department, where a hesitant secretary confirmed that a Dr. Paul Hartswell had taken leave 2 months ago for personal research. No one had heard from him since. "And Dr. Finch?" asked Whimsy. "Still here," said the secretary. "Would you like to speak with him?" Whimsy hesitated. "No, not yet. One curiosity at a time." He hung up, sat back, and allowed himself a single satisfied sigh. Someone had forced Delmore's hand, perhaps even blackmailed him. The greenhouse had been his retreat, his sanctum. He had guarded it jealously, and yet someone had been inside after his death. Someone who had reason to believe he left something behind. A letter, a secret, or perhaps an insurance. He rose again, walked to the window, and looked out at the garden where the sun was beginning to set. The greenhouse shimmered with late gold, its glass walls bright and opaque at once, like a secret trying to stay hidden. Behind him, a soft knock sounded. It was Hollis. "A letter came for you, sir, from London." Wimsey took it. Parker's handwriting. He opened it with his thumb, scanning the contents quickly. Blackwell, Clara Marion, age 36. Former nurse, St. Stephen's. Dismissed in 1923 under vague circumstances. Breach of conduct, no further detail. No fixed residence since. Involved in civil suit against Dr. P. Hartswell in 1924, which was dropped abruptly. Last known address matches your envelope. No record of death. Wimsey let the letter drift to the desk. So Clara Blackwell had been involved with Hartswell, possibly more than involved, and Dr. Delmore had stood between them, had once promised to protect her. Why? Because she'd been wronged, or because she knew too much? He turned to Hollis. "Send for Mrs. Blount, if you would." Politely, but firmly. The cook arrived 5 minutes later, dusting flour from her hands, her expression brittle. "I told you all I know." "You told me almost everything," said Wimsey, "but you didn't tell me about the soup, or why you lied about it." She hesitated. Just a breath, but it was enough. "I didn't lie." The maid remembered washing a soup bowl. "Thursday, the day your master died, you said he hated soup." She looked away. "He did, but he asked for it that day, said his stomach was uneasy. So you made it." She nodded reluctantly. "What kind?" "Watercress." "Did anyone else touch the bowl after it left your hands?" She blinked. "No." Hollis took it straight to the greenhouse, as usual. Wimsey turned slowly. Hollis looked stricken. "I did, sir, but I didn't touch it. Just placed it on the bench. Same as always." "Did you leave the door open?" "No, sir. Shut it behind me." Wimsey paced once around the room. "Someone else entered after you," he said aloud. "They brought nothing with them, but left something behind. Something invisible. A substance already present in the soup, or added after." He turned back to Hollis. "Fetch me that watering can." When it was brought, Wimsey opened the spout and sniffed carefully. Then he dipped a finger in and smiled. "Bitter almonds," he murmured. "Clever girl." He looked at the others. "The poison wasn't in the soup," he said. "It was in the water." Wimsey lowered the watering can to the desk with great delicacy, as though it contained the last irrefutable syllable of a confession. "Prussic acid," he said softly. "Hydrogen cyanide, to be scientific. Undetectable in trace amounts, quick to evaporate, and, in the right dosage, nearly indistinguishable from a heart attack, especially if the victim already had a weak constitution." Mrs. Blount crossed herself. "But the doctor wasn't weak," said Marjorie, who had gone pale. "He was irritating, manipulative, and pathologically punctual, but not frail." "That may be so," said Wimsey. "But even a strong heart can falter when pushed too hard, especially when helped along by a molecule or two of something unkind." He turned to Hollis. "You say you placed the soup in the greenhouse. Did you pour the water?" "No, sir. There was already a cup beside the bench when I went in. I assumed, I thought the doctor had prepared it himself. He liked his routines. I didn't touch it." Wimsey nodded. "Then whoever tampered with the water did so before you entered. That means they knew his habits intimately. Knew he always drank, while working, always alone, and that he preferred not to be disturbed." Mrs. Blount stirred. "But why now? He was careful. Paranoid even. Locked everything. Counted spoons." "Indeed," said Wimsey. "Which makes the timing curious, doesn't it? A man so cautious wouldn't have trusted just anyone to make his tea. Yet something changed. A letter, perhaps. A threat. A shift in loyalty. Or someone knew the balance had tipped at last. And they acted." He turned back to the drawer and extracted another of the Blackwell letters. This one was shorter, more rushed. You promised you'd destroy it. If it comes to light, everything ends. I cannot be left alone to answer for both of us. Marjorie moved to his side, peering over his shoulder. Both of us, she murmured. Do you think it was a suicide pact or some kind of cover-up? Whimsy looked at her with quiet intensity. I think your uncle held secrets like others hold weapons, but someone at last dared to take one back. He stepped away from the desk. Mrs. Blount, I'll need you to do something rather unorthodox. I'd like you to prepare that soup again, precisely as you did Thursday. She stiffened. You want me to poison it? No, he said quickly. Just the base, no additives. I need to verify something about the flavor, the scent. There may be a masking agent involved. She gave him a long look, then nodded. It'll take 20 minutes. When she left, Whimsy wandered again to the window, gaze drifting toward the greenhouse, which now seemed less a hothouse for orchids than a mausoleum of motives. Marjorie stood behind him. You think it was Clara Blackwell? I think she's the key, he said, but I doubt she delivered the final blow. Too many traces left behind. Someone else was here. Someone who thought they were cleaning up but left a scrap of envelope, a misplaced glove, a soup bowl washed too late. Marjorie frowned. Who? Whimsy gave her a long, unreadable look. When you brought your sketchbooks into the parlor earlier, he said, they were dry. No ink smudges, no wet charcoal. You weren't drawing. I wasn't in the mood, she said coolly. No, but you wanted to appear as though you were. Why? She said nothing. Because someone else was in the house, he continued, and you wanted an alibi. Perhaps for yourself, perhaps for someone else. She turned away sharply. You're inventing ghosts. No, he said gently. Just shining a light in dark corners. Did you know Dr. Delmore had changed his will, or that the new version has gone missing? She didn't answer. He intended to leave something to Miss Blackwell, Whimsy said. An endowment, perhaps, or silence money. Either way, it would have been inconvenient for some. Marjorie turned, fire behind her eyes now. He was cruel, Lord Whimsy. He ruined lives behind a curtain of respectability. He broke people, and then blamed them for being shattered. Clara wasn't the first. She just didn't vanish quietly. She came here, he said. Didn't she? She begged him to destroy the file, the one with her name on it. She said it would all come out. What happened in the clinic? What he made her do? He laughed, said she'd be nothing without his protection, just another hysteric. And then, I found her in the garden, Marjorie said, just after she left him. Her hands were shaking. She kept saying, it's over, it's done. I didn't know what she meant. Did she enter the greenhouse? I don't know, but I think she meant to frighten him. That's all, to show she wasn't afraid anymore. And then someone else used the opportunity, Whimsy finished. There was a knock. Mrs. Blount stood in the doorway, soup bowl in hand. Whimsy took it with a murmur of thanks and set it on the desk. The smell rose. Vegetal, clean, faintly peppery. He dipped a spoon, sipped, then paused. There, just beneath the watercress. Almonds. Marjorie leaned forward. It wasn't in the base. No, but it was already in the water before the soup was poured. A second contaminant, meant to blend with the soup's aroma to vanish once swallowed. He set the bowl down. And now, he said, we wait. For what? For Miss Clara Blackwell. I sent a wire to Parker an hour ago asking him to bring her here. If she has any answers, they'll come tonight. He turned to Hollis. Prepare the parlor and a pot of coffee. I suspect it will be a long evening. Night settled over the house like a veil soaked in secrets. The greenhouse loomed beyond the glass, its outline barely discernible against the garden, now silvered with moonlight. Whimsy paced the parlor slowly, sipping coffee, the letters spread before him like a hand of cards no one had learned to play. At 9:30, a motor car pulled into the gravel drive. Parker entered first, looking travel-worn but composed. Behind him came a woman of perhaps 35, hatless, with a wind-chapped face and eyes like a sealed door. Wimsey stood. "Miss Blackwell." She nodded once. "I'm Lord Peter Wimsey. Thank you for coming. I'm afraid this will be uncomfortable." She gave a tight smile. "It's nothing new." Parker remained by the door as Wimsey gestured for her to sit. "I believe you were here Thursday," he began. "You visited Dr. Delmore. You asked him to destroy something, perhaps a file implicating you in some medical misconduct. But he refused." She said nothing. "He promised to protect you once. But promises from Delmore were never gifts. They were chains." Still nothing. Then finally, he told me I owed him everything, and that debts never expired. Wimsey sat forward. "Did you poison him?" Her eyes rose, full of anger but not fear. "No, I thought about it, but I couldn't. I left, before he ate. I walked out through the garden and never turned back." "Who was with you?" "No one. But I saw someone arrive after. A young man, dark coat. He went in through the side gate." Wimsey exchanged a glance with Parker. "Did you recognize him?" Yes. I saw him once. In Oxford, with Dr. Hartswell." Wimsey stood. "That's it then, the final piece. Delmore held something over Hartswell, too. Clara was the pressure point, but Hartswell was the one with access. To compounds, to knowledge. He knew how to make the poison undetectable, and where it would be most effective. And he knew the soup routine," Parker added. Clara told him. Wimsey nodded. She came to threaten. But Hartswell came to silence. He turned to Marjorie, who had appeared in the doorway, drawn by the voices. "It wasn't you," he said quietly. "But you knew." She lowered her eyes. "I suspected," she whispered. "I found a note in my studio. From Hartswell. It said, 'He won't hurt you anymore.' I burned it." Wimsey looked at the room, at the teacup on the table, at the letters, at the soup. "It's done," he said. But even as the words left him, he knew it wasn't. Not truly, because no orchid ever bloomed without the soil remembering the root it grew from. Clara Blackwell sat stiffly on the edge of the armchair, hands clenched together in her lap. The fire hissed softly behind her, but she didn't seem to feel the warmth. Her gaze remained fixed on the carpet, lips pressed in a line that might have once been defiance, but now trembled under the weight of memory. Wimsey watched her for a long moment, then crossed to the sideboard and poured a second glass of brandy. He handed it to her without ceremony. She accepted it with a barely perceptible nod and took a small sip. "You saw Hartswell after you left the greenhouse," he said gently. "You didn't expect him to follow you." "No," she murmured. "He wasn't meant to be there. I hadn't spoken to him in months, not since—" She trailed off. Wimsey gave her time. "He knew about the file," she continued, "but I never told him what I planned to do. I only said I couldn't bear it anymore, that Delmore had something on both of us. He asked me what I meant, but I didn't explain. And yet he came." She gave a bitter smile. "Paul always knew how to listen between the lines." Parker stirred. "Do we know how he entered?" Wimsey nodded. "The side gate. Miss Delmore confirmed it, and Hollis left it unlatched when he went to fetch the gardener Thursday morning. A quiet man like Hartswell wouldn't have needed more than that. And the poison. Likely prepared in advance. He worked with organics. Synthesis of volatile compounds. I expect we'll find traces in his lab if it hasn't been scrubbed. He had motive, means, opportunity." Clara set the stage, but he brought the curtain down. She looked up at him. Then, tears standing in her eyes but held in check by sheer force of will. "He wasn't a killer," she said. "He was afraid, and I let him believe it was the only way." Whimsy knelt beside her, his tone softening. Sometimes the burden of guilt lies not in the act, but in the silence that surrounds it. Her shoulders sagged, the fight draining from her. "I was so tired of running," she whispered. Whimsy rose. "You won't have to. But I'll need your help, Miss Blackwell. Hartswell is still out there. If he believes Delmore's file survived, if he thinks you might betray him, he may try to vanish. Or worse." Parker stepped forward. "We can circulate his name, put out a quiet watch. If he's still in the country, someone will spot him, especially if he's panicking." "He's not the panicking type," Clara said. "He's methodical. When he's frightened, he retreats to order." "Then we start with where he's most at home," Whimsy said. "His lab at Oxford, or whatever's left of it." Parker glanced at his watch. "We can be there by morning." Whimsy turned to Marjorie, who had remained silent by the fireplace. "I'd prefer not to involve the local constabulary just yet," he said. "But I must ask, do you still have access to your uncle's files? Anything he kept outside that cabinet?" Marjorie nodded slowly. "There's a safe behind the bookcase. He used to keep more sensitive records there, the kind that didn't belong in formal archives." "Would you show me?" She hesitated only a moment, then led the way. They moved through the house in silence, Clara following at a distance. At the far end of the study, Marjorie ran her hand along the row of medical encyclopedias and pressed inward. A faint click, and a narrow panel swung forward, revealing a steel-faced safe embedded in the wall. "He kept the combination in a book," she said. "But I memorized it after he forgot it one Christmas. Just in case." Whimsy smiled faintly. "You have a good memory for accidents." The safe opened with a small groan. Inside, stacked folders lay beside a narrow box of index cards and a flat, oblong parcel wrapped in oilskin. Whimsy reached for the parcel first, unwrapping it slowly. Within was a folder marked C.M. Blackwell, P. Hartswell, 1923. The paper was yellowing but meticulously maintained. He turned the pages. Transcripts of hospital records, private notes, disciplinary reviews. Near the end, a typed letter with Delmore's signature, an affidavit of sorts. In it, he described a breach of medical ethics involving an unapproved trial of cardiac inhibitors on vulnerable patients, with Blackwell as the administering nurse and Hartswell the overseeing chemist. "He documented everything," Whimsy said, voice flat. "And kept it as leverage," Marjorie added bitterly. "He called it his insurance." Clara turned away. "It wasn't as simple as that. They approved the protocol, but not the dosages. Paul thought we could help them, speed up recovery times. You didn't mean to get caught," Whimsy said quietly. She didn't deny it. He returned the file to the oilskin and tucked it under his arm. "This is what Hartswell feared, the root of it all." Parker looked over his shoulder. "We should move quickly. If he knows you've found it—" "He won't yet," Whimsy said. "But he will. People like Hartswell can't bear uncertainty. He'll come looking for it." Clara spoke, her voice low. "Then use me." Whimsy looked at her. "You said he retreats to order," she continued. "He'll come to me if he thinks I've lost control. If I reach out, say I've cracked, that Delmore's file wasn't destroyed after all. He'll come." "You'd be putting yourself in danger." "I've been in danger for years," she said. "This time I want to choose it." Whimsy considered her for a long moment. "All right, but not alone. Parker? I'll arrange a tale. Discreet. Good. We'll send a message first thing. From her. Something desperate, but vague. That should draw him out." He turned to Marjorie. "We'll keep the file here for now, locked away again, but if anything happens, any sign of forced entry, anything at all, send word immediately." She nodded. "I will." Clara reached for her coat. "I'll need a place to stay in London, somewhere he won't expect." I know just the spot, Parker said. Safe house in Camden, dull enough to be invisible. Whimsy picked up the oilskin bundle and looked again at the room. The desk, the armchair, the fire slowly dying. All the artifacts of a man who had wrapped his life in neat folds and still managed to bleed through them in the end. Delmore died not from the poison, he said softly, but from the false safety of secrets. He built a fortress with other people's sins. Eventually, someone found a door. Outside, the wind picked up, rustling the hedges and whispering across the greenhouse glass. The orchids inside trembled on their stems, beautiful, delicate, bred for perfection, but always a little too close to rot. The file under his arm felt heavier than paper. The early morning mist hung over Oxford like the last exhalation of a dying scholar. Damp, stubborn, and faintly chemical in scent. Lord Peter Wimsey stepped down from the train at a pace that suggested leisure, but missed nothing. Behind him, Parker carried the oilskin-wrapped file in a nondescript satchel, its presence both mundane and quietly monumental. St. Severin's College crouched in its square of medieval stone like an aging cat, aloof, ivy-laced, and faintly judgmental. It had once housed alchemists and astronomers, and now boasted the finest toxicology laboratory in the county. Paul Hartswell's name was discreetly still listed among the faculty fellows, though Wimsey suspected the brass plaque outside his office would not survive the month. They met the college porter, a dry-lipped man named Sherlock, who smelt faintly of boiled ham and regarded visitors with mournful suspicion. Wimsey showed him a letter bearing the college warden's seal and the air of inevitability that always attended aristocracy with time to kill. Sherlock led them up a narrow stair and down a corridor hung with portraits of dead men who looked as though they'd each been poisoned by a rival over tea. He stopped outside a dark oak door, fumbled with a ring of keys, and swung it open. Hartswell's rooms were immaculate, unnaturally so, not just tidy, but devoid of the clutter that usually comes with research. The desk had been wiped down, the files emptied, the shelves neatly rearranged with blank spines outward. Wimsey moved slowly through the room, fingers trailing lightly over surfaces, as though listening through his fingertips. "He's gone," said Parker. "This place has been cleaned like a crime scene." "Quite so," murmured Wimsey, "but not scrubbed." He crouched beside the fireplace and withdrew a small length of twine from his pocket. He dangled it gently into the ash pan, catching fragments on the end. When he drew it back, Parker leaned in. Charred corners of labels, partly fused glass slivers, and something white and friable. "Catalogue tags," Parker said, "and a crucible fragment." He burned his notes, but not recently. "These ashes are old, at least 2 weeks." That fits the timeline. Delmore was killed last Thursday. Hartswell vanished the day after. Wimsey picked up a chair, turned it on one leg, and began inspecting the screw joints. "Then the real question," he murmured, "is not where he is now, but what he took with him before he left." Parker glanced through a narrow filing drawer, pulling out a sheaf of receipt duplicates. "Here," he said, "rail tickets, return trips to Bristol, 3 in the last month." Wimsey took the slips and raised his eyebrows. "West Country? No address?" "None listed." Sherlock cleared his throat from the doorway. "Begging your lordship's pardon, he did mention a cottage down there. Used to go for chemical air, he said. Old family place, but he never took guests." Wimsey straightened. "Do you recall the name of the village?" Sherlock frowned. "Something odd. Linton's Reach. Near the old Roman road, they say. Can't be more than a pub and a chapel now." "Perfect," said Wimsey. "I rather like places with only a pub and a chapel. Reminds one of the afterlife." He turned to Parker. "We'll wire Miss Blackwell from the station. Tell her the bait is laid, and have Inspector Gibbon send someone to watch her flat in Camden. Quietly, mind." As they stepped into the cold courtyard, the college bell began its sonorous toll. 8 deliberate strokes that seemed to echo too long in the fog. Whimsy paused. "That sound," he said, absently, "always struck me as funereal. You ever notice how bells don't tell the truth, Charles? They don't mark the hour. They mourn it." Parker snorted. They'd make good policemen, then. They were on the road to Linton's Reach before midday, the motor car chugging stoically through chalk downs and hedgerow lanes. As the miles slipped by, Whimsy leaned back, tapping a cigarette absently against the case on his knee. "There's something bothering me still," he said finally. Parker glanced sideways. "Only one thing?" In Miss Blackwell's account, she said Hartswell followed her to the greenhouse. But if he were already planning to kill Delmore, why wait? Why follow her, then return later? Parker shrugged. Doubt or opportunity. Maybe he wanted confirmation that Delmore hadn't destroyed the file. Perhaps. But then, why poison and not force? Why not simply break in and take it? Maybe he thought Clara already had it. Whimsy exhaled. Then he'd come to her, wouldn't he? Not to Delmore. He fell silent, gazing out at the black trees flicking past in the afternoon light. The village of Linton's Reach emerged like a fading ink blot, smeared against a curve of the landscape and already preparing for twilight. A sagging inn, an abandoned smithy, a crooked war memorial bearing 3 surnames repeated 6 times. The chapel stood shuttered, and the only sound was the ticking engine as the car cooled. They left the motor at the edge of the lane and followed a winding footpath through sodden heather. After 10 minutes, a grey stone chimney appeared, then the sloping roof of a modest cottage tucked beneath a copse of beech. The windows were curtained, smoke wreathed from the chimney in a thin stream. "He's here," Parker said grimly. Whimsy nodded. And expecting no one, they approached without stealth. Whimsy knocked twice. A moment later, the door opened a cautious inch. Paul Hartswell's face, paler and more drawn than before, appeared behind it. He did not look surprised. "I wondered how long it would take," he said. "May I assume you're not with the college?" Whimsy tipped his hat. "Not officially, though I've been known to frequent the libraries." Hartswell opened the door wider, stepping back. "Then come in. If you're here to arrest me, I'd rather be warm." The interior was dim but orderly. Books stacked with obsessive care, a narrow cot, a kettle steaming gently on the stove. A laboratory table stood in the corner, disturbingly clean. Whimsy took the armchair without invitation and studied him. "We found the ashes," he said. "And the file." Hartswell gave a flicker of a smile. "Then there's nothing left to protect." "Miss Blackwell disagrees. She sent word. Said you'd understand." A faint tremor passed through the man's frame. He sat. "She said that?" "She did. But she also said something else." Hartswell looked up. "She said you weren't a killer, that you acted out of fear." The man's expression didn't change. He merely clasped his hands tighter. "She's wrong," he said. "I am a killer, but I wasn't meant to be one." Parker stepped forward. "Then why not run properly? Why leave a trail at all?" "Because I wanted to be found," Hartswell said quietly. "Not by the police. By her. I thought if she came, if she could tell me it was justified, then I could live with it. But she didn't come." Whimsy leaned forward, voice low. "Do you want her to see you in the dock? To hear what Delmore did in court? Publicly?" Hartswell's knuckles whitened. "No." "Then help me end it cleanly. Confess. Not for the court. For her." The room was still for a long time. Then Hartswell stood, crossed to the desk, and opened a drawer. He withdrew a single page, already written, already signed. "I wrote it 3 nights ago," he said. "In case." Whimsy took the paper and read it silently. The confession was precise, unemotional, and complete. He folded it and slipped it into his coat. "There's a station in the next village," Parker said. We can walk." Hartswell nodded. "I'll come." Outside, the wind picked up. Behind them, the cottage remained still, shuttered, self-contained, a place built for silence and retreat, now left to its own ghosts. As they walked down the lane, Whimsy didn't speak. Not until the sign for the station came into view. Then, without looking at anyone, he said, "Funny thing about greenhouses, Charles. You grow fragile things in them, not because they're weak, but because the world is too brutal to let them live otherwise." Neither man replied. But behind them, something old and poisonous had finally been exposed to air. The train back to London clattered through dusk like a metronome marking the closing bars of a dirge. Whimsy sat alone in the corner compartment, the confession in his coat pocket, the countryside sliding past like a stage set being dismantled behind him. Hartswell had gone quietly at the station, offering no resistance. Parker had escorted him with that same mix of detachment and weariness that long service breeds in honest policemen. Whimsy hadn't spoken to Hartswell again. There had been nothing left to say. The truth, once exposed, has a way of silencing its keepers. Back in the city, the rain had started. The streets gleamed under gaslight, slick with oil and reflection. Whimsy stepped from the cab outside Clara Blackwell's temporary flat in Camden and adjusted his hat against the drizzle. It was a safe house in name only, clean but austere, with mismatched furniture and the lingering smell of fresh paint, designed, perhaps, to discourage anyone from staying longer than necessary. She opened the door before he knocked. "He's been found," she said. Not a question. Whimsy stepped inside. He turned himself in effect. We were in time. She said nothing, only moved to the window, arms folded tightly across her chest. "He left a written confession," he added. "Full account. He named you, but not as an accomplice, only as the one who tried to stop him. It won't reach the papers if that's your worry." "That's not my worry," she said quietly. "Not anymore." He watched her a moment, then crossed to the small table where a kettle steamed gently over a makeshift heater. "You still take sugar?" She didn't answer, and he took that as a yes. 2 lumps stirred in silence. When he handed her the cup, her fingers lingered a moment longer than necessary. She hadn't slept. It showed in the tightness around her mouth, in the fixed intensity of her eyes. "I lied to you," she said. "Yes," he replied evenly, "but only a little. I told you I didn't know what Paul planned, that I only wanted to confront Delmore, but that's not entirely true." "I assumed as much," Whimsy said. "The tone of your letter, the timing, it was too precise for coincidence. You hoped he'd act." "I was angry," she said. "Angry at what Delmore had done to both of us. Angry at the way he sat in that house like a king among skeletons. I thought if Paul came, he might scare him, make him burn the file, or leave. But he didn't leave," Whimsy said softly. "He died." Clara turned away. "I never meant for it to end like that." "No," he agreed. "But you opened the door." Silence again, broken only by the gentle hiss of the heater. "Will there be a trial?" "Yes," Whimsy said, "but likely closed. The Medical Ethics Board will weigh in. They'll want to make an example of someone. Better Hartswell than the institution itself." She gave a bitter laugh. "Of course." He watched her for a long moment. "There's one part of the story that still doesn't sit straight," he said finally. "Not about the murder, but before. The file Delmore kept, the trial that ruined your record. You never asked me to destroy it, not even when you knew we had it." She looked up sharply. "You were ready to run," he continued. "You thought Hartswell might kill again, but you never asked me to burn the evidence." She swallowed, hard. "Because I couldn't. Not anymore." "Why not?" "Because it's true," she said. "Every word. We experimented. We hurt people. We didn't mean to, but we did. And Delmore kept the proof like a man who enjoys holding someone underwater, just long enough to watch them struggle. And yet you didn't destroy it. Because maybe it deserves to be read, she said. Not in a courtroom, but somewhere, by someone, to know what not to become. He nodded slowly. That takes more courage than silence. The clock on the wall ticked past 9. Somewhere below, a lorry rumbled past, trailing fog in its wake. I'm leaving, she said suddenly. I can't stay here. Whimsy didn't ask where. Somewhere quieter, she added. Not for escape, just for peace. He rose, took his coat. Then I hope you find it. She followed him to the door, but before he stepped into the rain, she caught his sleeve. You said once that secrets were like greenhouses, warm inside, but always growing things that couldn't live in daylight. I did. Then what do you do with the ones that have already flowered? He looked at her. You let them go to seed, he said, and pray they don't take root again. She watched him walk down the narrow stairs and disappear into the wet blur of the city. 2 days later, Whimsy stood once more in the late Dr. Delmore's study, now emptied of its menace. The fire was cold, the desk cleared, and the safe stood open and bare. Marjorie Delmore was packing a final box of her uncle's books, wrapped carefully in brown paper. She looked up as he entered. It's done, she asked. As much as these things ever are, he replied. She gestured to a stack of leather-bound notebooks. I found his diaries. Nothing about the Blackwell case, but plenty of others. He kept records on everyone. Even me, I think. Whimsy raised an eyebrow. What did he write? She gave a faint smile. That I was sentimental. Unfit for medicine. He wasn't entirely wrong. No, she said, but I think I'll keep the books. Sometimes knowing what people thought of you helps you become something else. Whimsy helped her lift the last box and paused by the window. Outside, the garden shimmered in morning dew. The greenhouse stood locked now, its orchids slowly withering under neglect. He thought of Hartswell's confession, of Clara's resolve, of Delmore, watching from behind his mask of cold benevolence as everyone around him paid for his knowledge. And then he turned back to Marjorie. If you ever tire of the books, he said, burn them. Some truths aren't worth the paper they're written on. She nodded, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Whimsy picked up his hat and stepped into the morning. The wind had shifted, carrying with it the faintest scent of scorched leaves and something cleaner beneath. The promise, perhaps, of rain without poison. Whimsy did not return directly to Piccadilly after departing the Delmore house. Instead, he instructed the driver to take him to Bloomsbury, where a modestly distinguished red-brick building housed the Medical Records and Ethics Council. A creature of impulse, some had called him, though in truth his impulses were simply logic dressed in tweed, moving a few steps ahead of convention. He ascended the stairs quietly, removed his hat as if entering a chapel, and presented his card. Within 10 minutes, he was seated across from an elderly registrar whose collar appeared to have been starched around the Crimean War, and who regarded Whimsy with the vaguely pained expression of a man expecting a very bad poem. I won't trouble you long, said Whimsy, smiling as he lit a cigarette with elaborate courtesy. I merely require access to a set of medical disciplinary records, circa 1920. A trial, well, more a hearing regarding one Miss Clara Blackwell and Dr. Paul Hartswell of the Delmore Institute. The registrar blinked as though someone had asked him to recite a list of former lovers. Those proceedings were sealed, Lord Peter. Yes, said Whimsy cheerfully, but I suspect they were sealed in the wrong box. You see, it's rather important that I examine them, not to prosecute, you understand, but to contextualize. The man leaned forward slightly, like a crow about to peck at a walnut. You'll find nothing there of criminal nature, my lord. Merely poor judgment. The kind that used to be punished with exile to some educational backwater or a conveniently extended sabbatical. Even poor judgment has consequences. murmured Whimsy, exhaling smoke through his nose. "Especially when men like Delmore refine it into blackmail." The registrar's gaze sharpened. "That name is not to be taken lightly in these halls." "No," agreed Whimsy, "which is precisely why I must look." Eventually, the man relented. After the requisite bureaucratic rustling and a long absence punctuated only by the occasional sneeze from deeper within the archives, he returned with a thin, creased dossier bound with waxed cord. Whimsy took it in his gloved hands and opened the first page. He read in silence, the dust of another age clinging to the margins. What emerged was a story more tragic than criminal. An ambitious pair of young researchers, eager to impress, swept up in a delusion of innovation. A trial program using experimental sedatives in combination with memory retrieval therapy had resulted in 2 patients suffering permanent dissociation and 1, quietly redacted, suspected suicide. Delmore, then just the patron behind the funding, had sat in silent judgment, deflecting scrutiny away from the Institute's administration and focusing it squarely upon Hartswell and Blackwell. Their notes, quoted throughout, reflected in equal parts naivete and horror. The final judgment had been lenient but decisive. Miss Blackwell was removed from all further research. Hartswell was reassigned under supervision. No law had been broken, but the reputation was effectively destroyed. Whimsy closed the file. "It wasn't the scandal that broke them," he murmured. "It was being told they were no longer permitted to think." He returned the dossier without another word, only a polite nod, and stepped once more into the wind. The hour was now late afternoon, and London wore its June clouds like a borrowed coat, too heavy for the season, yet oddly fitting for its mood. He walked rather than took a cab, allowing the pavement and the intermittent cry of street sellers to arrange themselves into order. Back at his flat, he found Bunter waiting, as always, with the quiet competency of a man whose standards exceeded those of most empires. Tea was ready, the tray arranged with surgical precision. "Any word from Parker?" asked Whimsy as he settled into the armchair with a sigh that suggested the day had left too many corners untucked. "Yes, my lord. He telephoned not 20 minutes ago. Hartswell has confessed to everything as expected. The file has been turned over, but there is one small detail that disturbed the inspector." "Oh, yes, my lord. According to the pathologist's report, the bruising on Delmore's neck was slightly inconsistent with Hartswell's account. The grip strength suggests hesitation, followed by an abrupt increase in pressure, a burst of rage rather than a calculated act." Whimsy stirred his tea. "That doesn't match the calm, deliberate tone of Hartswell's written confession." "No, my lord. It suggests there may have been an interruption or some new emotional trigger at the scene." Whimsy tapped the spoon against the porcelain and stood abruptly. "Bunter, we're going back to the greenhouse." They arrived just as twilight was beginning to steal across the grounds like spilled ink. The house was now fully shuttered, its ownership pending dispute, its garden disheveled but no longer funereal. A constable posted at the gate recognized Whimsy and allowed him through without delay. Inside the greenhouse, the air was close and damp, thick with the scent of decay and dying orchids. The broken bench had been removed, the bloodstain scrubbed, though not convincingly. Whimsy walked slowly to the spot where Delmore had fallen. He crouched. "There's something not right here, Bunter." "My lord?" Whimsy gestured. "The trail of bruises on Delmore's body doesn't start at the throat. It starts at the shoulder. Someone gripped him first by the collar, pulled him round, then the pressure at the throat. But more than that, look here." He pointed to a small mark on the floor. It had gone unnoticed during the first investigation, a faint smear of soot, circular, with a crescent void in its center. "A heel print," said Whimsy, "high-heeled and recent." He stood. "Bunter, Clara Blackwell was wearing walking shoes the night we found her. Sensible heels. But Marjorie Delmore, she wore a different sort, a nurse's heel. Rubber, small, and when we saw her last, she was carrying a box of her uncle's possessions, including the notebooks. You believe she was there during the murder, my lord? Not during, said Wimsey, but moments before. They drove directly to Harley Street. Marjorie had given up the Delmore house but was still practicing at the public dispensary nearby. She met them in the waiting room, her hands damp with antiseptic, her expression unreadable. I thought this was over, she said. So did I, said Wimsey, until I saw the print. Tell me, Miss Delmore, why? Did you return to the greenhouse after your uncle's death? She stiffened. I didn't. You did. You returned before the body was found, didn't you? Before Clara Blackwell called for help. Her gaze dropped. Yes. Why? To make sure he was dead. Wimsey nodded slowly. And? I found Paul still there, shaking, covered in blood. He hadn't meant to go through with it, but something Delmore said. I don't know what. Paul snapped, and She broke off. You helped him, said Wimsey. You rearranged the body. You wiped something away. No, she said. I didn't change anything. I just told him to leave, that I'd say nothing, that it was over. But it wasn't, was it? He wrote the confession the next morning. He couldn't live with it. Wimsey's eyes were sharp now. But you could. Marjorie looked at him, and something behind her calm face frayed. I've lived with my uncle for 10 years. You cannot imagine what that costs. Wimsey said nothing. He understood, all too well. But I didn't kill him, she said. I wanted to. I thought about it, but in the end I only watched. Sometimes, said Wimsey quietly. That's all it takes. He left her standing there beneath the clinic's harsh light, her figure very straight, her mouth tight, her white coat buttoned as if against the truth. Back in the cab, Bunter said nothing for a long while. Will you tell the police, my lord? No, said Wimsey. Hartswell has confessed, the law has what it needs, and the rest, well, the rest is another kind of justice. He closed his eyes and let the city pass him by. The next morning arrived in a fit of grey temper, rain streaking the windows at 110A Piccadilly like the slow tears of a world resolving itself too late. Wimsey sat at his writing desk, pen uncapped but motionless over a half-finished letter to Parker. The confession was filed, the case nominally closed, and yet there it was again, that faint, insistent feeling like a string out of tune in an otherwise well-tuned quartet. Something yet unplucked, something not quite accounted for. He rose, poured himself a small glass of black currant brandy, his one concession to the invalid's corner of the spirit's cabinet, and turned instead to his notebook. The rough chronology of events sat in orderly, spidery lines, the hours painstakingly verified, the distances rechecked with Bunter's customary meticulousness. Delmore had died between 8:20 and 8:35 p.m. on a Tuesday evening. Hartswell, by his own account, entered the greenhouse shortly after 8, stayed no more than 15 minutes, and then fled. Clara Blackwell arrived 5 minutes later and discovered the body. But Marjorie Delmore's presence, silent, ambiguous, and unrecorded, remained a thorn. Wimsey frowned. She had claimed to have arrived after the murder. But that heel print, well-placed, undisturbed, suggested otherwise. It had not been walked over, nor had it smeared in the way it ought to have, had Hartswell been pacing in agitation. She had been there first, possibly before Hartswell arrived, possibly long enough to have said something, to have triggered something. A sudden memory came to him then, not from the greenhouse, but from Marjorie's flat during their first interview. The drawing on the mantel, the faint watercolor, an orchid in bloom, Paphiopedilum venustum, its petals delicately rendered, its color unmistakable. And yet in the greenhouse, among the rows of withering plants, Wimsey had seen no such orchid, not even a dead one, which meant one of two things. Marjorie had painted it from memory, or she had taken it before the murder, removed it, preserved it, A curious thing to do after one's uncle has been strangled. He summoned Bunter with a brisk tap of the bell. "Bunter, we're making one final stop." "At the Institute, my lord." "No," said Whimsy. "To the florist on Brook Street. Miss Delmore had a favorite orchid, and I believe it may explain what her conscience cannot." The florist, a grizzled man with soil-stained cuffs and an air of permanent grievance against the sun, recalled the customer in question at once. "Lady Doctor, serious sort. Comes every few months for cuttings, always knows her names, bit exacting about it." "Did she ever bring in a live plant?" "Once, yes. Said it had grown wrong. Brought it in wrapped in muslin, she did. Left it for me to look at, see if it could be salvaged. Told her it had root rot. Nothing to be done." "And when was that?" "Week before last. Tuesday, I think." Whimsy nodded. "Did she seem distressed?" The florist scratched his head. "Not exactly, but she looked odd, like she was memorizing the shop just in case she didn't come back." That fit the timeline too closely to be coincidence. "Thank you," said Whimsy. "That will do perfectly." They returned once more to the Institute, now under new temporary management, the corridors smelling faintly of old antiseptic and newly polished gilt. The nurse at reception allowed them into Marjorie's office with only the mildest protest. It was a spare space, half clinic, half cloister. On the wall hung a photograph of her medical school class. Her nameplate still rested on the desk. Whimsy opened a small cabinet and found, wrapped in linen, the orchid cutting, browned now at the edges, but still recognizable by its distinctive twisted lip. He studied it for a long moment. "Bunter, tell me, do you remember what Delmore called his niece at dinner?" Bunter, without hesitation, replied, "A disappointment, my lord. A moral parasite living off his name." "Exactly, and yet she'd stayed." "Some sense of obligation, perhaps." "Or something else," said Whimsy. "Something she'd found. Too late. Something that made her hesitate to leave. Like an orchid too sick to be saved." He folded the plant back into its cloth, replaced it, and turned to leave. But not before noticing a narrow notebook tucked among folders of patient charts. It was not standard issue. A private journal, perhaps. On impulse, he slipped it into his coat. Back home, he read it slowly over brandy. It was not a diary, but a ledger of sorts. Half sketches, half notes. Medical diagrams, studies in botanical cross-sections, and, towards the back, 4 pages written in small, tense script. A letter never sent. "To whom it may concern," it began dispassionately, like a medical report. The words that followed told of a young girl raised under scrutiny, her failures documented, her ambitions dismissed as derivative. She spoke of her uncle's brilliance, yes, but also of his hunger to control, of how he'd advised her early in her career to abandon surgery for nursing. Less blood, more tending. Of how she'd taken that as an insult, only to realize much later it had been an assignment of role, not a critique. He was creating a mirror, the letter said. A version of himself without the dangers of intellect, a living sycophant to admire him in silence. And then she wrote of a final argument, of confronting Delmore with the truth of the trial, that he had engineered the failure, had fed them faulty compounds, then hung them with the results, to keep them malleable, obedient, loyal. "I told him," the letter concluded, "that I knew everything, that I had the letters, the receipts, the formula changes. I told him I would leave, publish, destroy his legacy, if he so much as threatened Clara again. And he only laughed. He said, 'You'll do nothing. You've always done nothing.'" The last sentence, scrawled hastily, was barely legible. "But I am not nothing. I am the consequence." Whimsy laid the notebook down. She had not killed him with her hands, but she had wielded the knife. The weapon had been her revelation. She had known Hartswell would come. She had prepared the scene. A torch dropped, a path lit. She had pulled the first pin, and the whole edifice had collapsed accordingly. The next morning, Whimsy sent the notebook to Parker with a single-page covering note. For the file only. Not to be acted on. Some truths, you understand, make better ghosts than headlines. A week passed. Hartswell entered formal plea arrangements. Clara Blackwell left England for a position at a sanatorium in Switzerland. Marjorie Delmore resigned her post and disappeared quietly into the Midlands under her mother's name. The Institute released a public statement condemning Delmore's moral transgressions while saluting his scientific achievements. And Whimsy, on a bright Sunday morning, returned once more to the Shuttered Greenhouse. It had been cleaned now, the benches swept, the broken panes replaced, but the orchids were gone. All of them. The soil lay bare. He stood alone in that strange, too quiet sanctum and thought of all that had grown here. Not only flowers, but secrets. The cultivated silences of a man who had styled himself a god. And the final flowering of truth, untended but inevitable. Whimsy removed his hat. "Nothing human should be grown in glass," he murmured. "It doesn't survive the frost." And with that, he turned and left, the door clicking softly shut behind him. The fire in the grate had settled into a polite whisper when Charles Parker arrived at 110A Piccadilly, his coat damp with mist and his expression split between irritation and admiration, a look Whimsy had often coaxed from him over the years. Bunter took his hat and gloves as reverently as if they were relics from a cathedral, and withdrew. "I've read it," Parker said without preamble, settling into the chair opposite Whimsy, who was nursing a cigarette and idly tracing the rim of a glass. "The notebook? Not exactly cheerful bedtime reading, was it?" Whimsy offered, exhaling a neat column of smoke toward the ceiling. Parker leaned forward, elbows on knees. "You realize what it is? A confession in everything but name. A provocation, even." Whimsy nodded. "A blade without fingerprints. The blow was never hers, merely permitted." "Permitted?" Parker echoed, incredulous. "My dear Charles, Delmore wasn't murdered by a person so much as by a series of realizations. Miss Delmore lit a slow fuse and left. Hartswell merely struck the match." Parker frowned, but not in disagreement. "She laid out the conditions," Whimsy went on, "then walked away from them. She knew what he'd done to Clara. She knew what he'd done to her career. But most of all, she understood what kind of creature he was, a man who thought people were things, interchangeable, edible even, so long as they gave him credit. That's why she took the orchid, you know. It had root rot. She didn't want it to die in his care." "You're quite sure of this?" Whimsy smiled faintly. "I'm never quite sure of anything, but I've rarely been less unsure." There was a silence then. The rain had resumed its tapping, now against the edges of the balcony rail, as if trying to signal something important and being consistently ignored. "What would you have done?" Parker asked at last. "Had she stayed? Had she finished it herself?" Whimsy gave a thoughtful pause. "Would have depended, I suppose, on whether she tried to justify it with Latin." They both smiled at that, thin and dry. Eventually, Parker rose, brushing the front of his coat. "I shall file your note with the rest. The official story holds. And a fine, upstanding one it is. Man provoked, strikes out, confesses, repents. Woman saved. Legacy disgraced, but not dismantled. We've tied it all up, haven't we?" Parker hesitated. "Have we?" Whimsy stood and walked to the window, watching the blurred headlights of taxis sweep past like disinterested constellations. "You know, Charles, there's a breed of person who thinks solving a mystery is like solving a sum. Input all the right variables, deduce the unknowns, and voila, the answer appears, neat and whole. But the thing about murder is, it's never really one act. It's pressure, long and slow, like the making of coal. By the time it burns, The real damage has already been done." Parker said nothing. Whimsy turned from the window with a sudden lightness. "I've taken to gardening," he said brightly. "Figured I might try my hand at something that grows when tended rather than explodes when examined." "Just don't take on orchids," said Parker dryly. Whimsy's eyes glinted. "No," he said, "I think orchids are rather best left to themselves. Or, if you must have them, kept behind glass, with the key somewhere out of reach." As Parker left, Bunter reappeared like an afterthought in tweed. "Would your lordship require anything further?" "No, Bunter. Just quiet tonight." Bunter gave a short bow and vanished. Whimsy returned to his chair, lifted his book, and, after a moment's thought, closed it again. He stared into the fire, which now flared with occasional brilliance, a spark here, a flicker there, as though attempting to render judgment in Morse code. The greenhouse shuttered again. The secrets buried but not forgotten. A woman who had walked to the brink and then walked away, a man who had committed murder with a pair of hands, and another who had killed with years, and Peter Whimsy, alone as always, with the echoes. "A clever trick," he murmured to the room, "to stage a murder and never touch the corpse." Then he smiled and recited softly to the flames. "A little fire is quickly trodden out, which being suffered, rivers cannot quench." And with that, he reached for his book again and let the mystery sleep.